So just to say a little bit about myself, I, as Joe said, Preventer Conservator, but previously to working for Spencer and Fry, I worked for English Heritage, where one of my roles was to think about emergency planning for the 400 sites that they look after. So I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that they didn't burn down or leak, and then getting prepared for what we would do if that did happen. So I've seen the forms that you submitted for the training. So I've got a little bit of background to sort of what you're hoping to achieve. But if anybody has anything they really want to get out of today, if they want to put it in the chat now, I will just try and remember to absolutely cover that. And also, if anybody has had an incident at their or emergency at their museum, if you want to just put it in the chat, that would be super helpful, because I might call on you to talk about your experience if that's the case. Just see if anything comes through, perhaps while people are writing, or not, you don't have to if you don't want to, but perhaps with that sort of underway, I will just go over what we're going to be covering today. So
Claire, sorry, I'll keep an eye on the chat, and then if
thank you.
At half time, if we want to go over the questions with that, that's probably a good way forward.
Perfect, thank you. No, thank you, Mike. So Cranbrook Museum wants to be prepared for accreditation. Okay, yep, so that's a good reason to think about emergency planning. I'm just trying to work out how to forward the slides, because that's not. Oh, there we go. Had to click on the page. So what we're going to think about today. Okay, that's fair enough. Oh, you can't hear anything. John, I don't know if you want to look at that. Our IT department has stopped us using the Zoom app. I'm accessing through a browser and can't hear anything.
We will be recording the session. Yeah. So sorry, John.
No, I was going to say I'm not really sure what we can do about that. As Joe says, we are recording the session, so hopefully you may be able to at least view it afterwards. But yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know.
I can hear you anyway.
Thank you. Okay, I'll keep going. It's not just me talking to myself. It's a bit difficult with these Zoom things, isn't it? Sort of talking to a laptop. So today we're going to think about different stages of emergency planning, what types of emergencies or incidents or disasters we might be facing, have a bit of a think about why bother to plan for emergencies, what would make a good emergency plan, how we can test a plan, and there's a typo, what is required for accreditation, and if you're doing a benchmark survey. So just to say that there are different stages of emergency planning. It's not all about just having a folder on your shelf with sort of information that's updated once a year. So the first sort of stage of emergency planning is assessment. So when I worked in America, we spent a lot of time preparing for tornadoes and earthquakes, whereas that's not such a big problem over here. So it's thinking about what kind of emergencies you might be facing. If you're by a river, you're going to have floods. So starting to think about what could affect your museum. Then really we want to prevent anything from happening. So things like testing electrics, having good maintenance of gutters and downpipes are all things that we can do to hopefully stop any floods or water ingress or fires from happening. So the next stage is preparedness, and this is the training you're doing today. So well done, you're already on stage 3 of emergency planning. So it's just getting ready and having things in place that if something does happen, you are prepared and you have certain information or equipment that is ready to go to help you deal with something. The next stage is reaction. This is where something's happened. You are then going into salvage. You're going into trying to get objects out that are at risk or at damaged, and dealing with a fire, flood, whatever might be an incident. Recovery. So we're going to start thinking about now conserving objects, drying out buildings, putting things in place where you can open back up again to the public. And it's always useful to have a review after any incident to see what lessons were learned, what would have helped next time, so you can learn from it. And every time there's a big emergency, like Clarendon or Up Ark or Windsor Castle, there's reports written, and in Heritage, so conservators or people responsible for emergency planning will usually read those and see what happened and think about ways that we could prepare if this sort of incident happened again. So, types of emergency. What is an emergency? What kind of things should we be concerned about as an emergency for our museums? If you want to put it in the chat, or if you feel more comfortable unmuting and saying out loud, that's absolutely fine. So any emergency.
My museum's right by a river, so flooding's always a slight risk.
Perfect. So flooding, absolutely. Anything that causes a risk to business, absolutely. Fire, yep, fire is the big one. Flooding, great. So anything that causes a closure to business, so that is quite interesting. So things that sort of come to my mind when I think about emergency is the fire, flood, water ingress from leaks or plumbing, theft, vandalism, earthquake, hurricane, tornadoes, very, very rare in this country. Dover Castle has had a mini hurricane. Terrorism, storm damage, building collapse, chemical leak, mold outbreak is starting to be addressed in some people's emergency plans. Landslide, gas leak, metal theft, and of course now people are starting to think about pandemic. Should they be prepared if there is another lockdown, another pandemic in the future? So it's really difficult to know what sort of emergencies are happening in the UK, because we don't centrally record when people have an incident or if there's been a near miss, which is also really interesting. But the closest we have is that a survey was carried out in 2005, 2006 by the Museum of London. And they found out of all the museums they surveyed, 30% had experienced some kind of disaster in the past 5 years. And an unlucky 21 had experienced more than one. So these are the disasters. And today I'm going to be talking about emergencies or incidents and disasters. Some museums classify those, but I think for the sake of today, I'm just probably going to talk about incidents or emergencies sort of interchangeably. So these are the incidents that the museums had sort of suffered, and these are the percentages in no order of these incidents occurring. So what do we think, if you want to put in the chat or shout out, what do we think came in least? What do we think 2% of the museums had experienced? So out of that list, the least likely.
Say bomb incident or terrorist threat?
Yep. So absolutely. So a bomb incident or terrorist threat came in at 2%. Current world affairs, it might be increasing. It does happen. So there was a terror plot that was found that were hoping to attack the British Museum. So it's out there. You have to be aware of security, probably more the big London museums, but it was at 2%. So that was very, very low. What do we think comes in next at 3%? What's worth a punt? I can't see my next slide actually, so I'm trying to remember as well.
Vandalism.
Okay, you are brilliant. You guys are on form today. You are absolutely right. So vandalism comes in at 3%. And sadly it does happen. So this is Chiswick House, where they have these beautiful sphinxes, and every so often, if there's been a big Friday night, one of the heads gets knocked off, which is unfortunate because there's replicas and there's real ones, and they always manage to, I'm sure by coincidence, find the real one. You might know this painting. So Rembrandt has been attacked 3 times, I think twice with sharp objects, once with acid. This is the Guildhall in 2002. Somebody went in to attack the statue of Margaret Thatcher. The bizarre thing about this incident is that actually they took in a cricket bat and didn't manage to cause any damage with a cricket bat. So they picked up the stanchion that was in front of the statue and managed to knock the head off with a stanchion. So sometimes vandalism can be political. And that was also the case at the Tate with the Rothko, where an act of yellowism caused someone to, or or was when somebody wrote on one of the paintings, and in fact was jailed for that. And then we see that sometimes heritage is a bit of a, well, I suppose another political example, that when the Trump mob stormed the US Capitol building, they tried to grab the ballot boxes and destroy them, but they were saved. Graffiti, some form of vandalism. So when I've done this training before, someone said that if kids drawing on things and pencils was classed as vandalism, then it would be a lot higher than 3%. But this is a room in Pompeii that was recently excavated, and within 2-3 years, people had already started graffitiing the excavated room, which is a real shame. And then sometimes it's just a bit mindless. So this is the pocket pistol at Dover Castle, presented to Henry VIII. It's a bit of a joke because it's huge, it won't fit in your pocket, so that I guess is 16th century humour. But it's right inside the cafe, so every day people have to pull out Coke cans, crisp packets, orange peel. So vandalism does happen. It can range from just annoying to quite serious, but again, it's at 3%, so fairly low. What do we think comes in next at 6%? No, okay, that's fine. So crumbs, went too far. So theft, break and burglary comes in next. This is what I always think of when I think of theft, and this is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, where lots of amazing works of art were taken. And the reason I bring this up, because it was a while ago, is that theft can be opportunistic. People see something, they want to steal it. It can also be highly organized. So police in the Met, who are responsible for heritage, has said now that art crime is second to drugs for being the most lucrative thing that organized crime can carry out. So there's lots of people who are very sort of organized and resourced, who want to steal museum objects. And just a few recent examples are the Viking objects taken in Norway. Sweden's crown jewels were stolen. Dresden had lots of cultural treasures taken from a vault. And over here in the UK, the Portland tiara was stolen within minutes from a really good museum quality standard display case. So it's not just this section of the training is not to try and scare everybody, but it's just to remind us that these things do happen and we have to try and prepare and prevent them. So we've got 11%, 10% and 68% left. So what do we think comes in at 10%? Does anybody want to have a guess in the chat? Or call out? Fire. So not quite fire. It's other, which is a wide remit from building collapse to IT power failure. But building collapse can happen. So this is the historical archive in the city of Cologne, and in March 2009 the building collapsed. It's not, as far as I'm aware, been related to, but they were digging a subway underneath close by. 90% of the archives were buried, and it was estimated at the time that it would cost 400 million euros to restore and repair the damage to the collection. So at this point, sort of some people would question, well, how do you prepare? How would emergency planning prepare you for just one day your building collapsing? And I should say that nobody from the archives were hurt in that collapse. But how do you prepare for something like that? So perhaps one of the most shocking things to happen recently, we're coming up to the 20-year anniversary, was September the 11th, 2001, where 3 planes purposely crashed into American buildings. And a report commissioned by Heritage Preservation America called Cataclysm and Challenge, the impact of September the 11th, 2001 on our national cultural heritage, found that although the events of September the 11th were caused by an unprecedented act of terror, we found that standard proven emergency management plans and responses turned out to be the most effective way of dealing with a disaster. So nobody had an emergency plan on what to do if planes were flown into the World Trade Center, but what they had done is thought about what would happen if there was a fire or a chemical leak near their museum. So some, like I think it was the Jewish Museum, had put in instructions about how to shut down the ventilation system so that air wasn't being taken in from outside, and how they could do that mechanically if there was no power. And because they carried out that, they probably saved their collection from being covered in everything that was in the air that day. So for anybody, I'm sure that I'm not, well, if anybody at this point is thinking, oh, what's the point of an emergency plan, or I'm doing it just for accreditation, actually having information to hand that can help you deal with something unexpected has been proven to be really useful. So we've got 2 left now. We've got 68% and 11%, and we've got fire and water damage. Does anybody want to have a guess what comes in at 11%?
Fire.
Fire, absolutely. So fire comes in at 11%. So the reason I sort of say this is that when people write emergency plans, more often than not, they write emergency plans for a fire. And although you have to have measures in place that would help you respond to one, it does come in at 11%. So luckily, they're still relatively rare. Why isn't that working? Oh, I've clicked on that. Okay, so they do happen. So here are some fires that happened the last few years. So Glasgow School of Arts burnt down, sadly, twice. Clarendon Park and National Trust House in 2015. The Cumin Museum in London, 2013. Battersea Arts Centre, 2015. And then, of course, Notre Dame was perhaps one of the biggest ones most recently. So fire, when it does happen, is completely devastating. So this is the library at Glasgow School of Art on the left before the fire, on to the right after the first fire. And this is Clarendon, and this is the famous Marble Hall in Clarendon. And on the right, you can see after the fire, they're clearing it in an archaeological dig. So that sort of consumed the whole building, but they managed to save quite a lot of the collection at Clarendon, and they will be reinstating some of the ground floor rooms. So it's taken a long time, but Clarendon does have a future. So finally, we're left with water damage. So 68% of emergencies that have been recorded were water damage. So it's really important that you address what you do if you have water ingress in your plan. So it can be a flood, and there's been some really bad floods. I think Florence, 1966, Prague, 2002, Paris, 2016, and most recently Germany have had water rising that has affected cultural institutions. We are seeing increased rainfall, these sort of heavier, shorter summer storms. We're getting more flooding from surface water flooding. As areas get more built up, there's less green areas to soak up rainfall, so it's flowing across tarmac and finding places to flood. And I speak from bitter experience because my house flooded from surface water flooding, although we're on a hill. So this is something that we have to think of. But most likely flooding is going to be from plumbing failures or people not looking after guttering and downpipes. And when I been working with one property years ago, and they decided to save £300 by stopping the person coming to clean out their gutters. Gutters got blocked, they had a leak, and it was thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of damage to historic interiors that they had to pay to get repaired. So just a simple thing like clearing gutters is incredibly important. So prevention, that's the next stage of emergency planning. I'm just going to talk about it very briefly, but having good maintenance, making sure that when there's building work, that it's being done properly. There's lots of tales, and I know, speaking from personal experience, where plumbing work has been altered during the day, and in the evening when the heating is coming on, there's been leaks. And also detection. So it's really important that you have good smoke detection. Some people are starting to install water leak detection. So if something does happen, you're alerted as quickly as possible. Another good way of preventing fires is to think about electrical loading at your property. So this is a castle where out of 2 plugs, they have their radios, a water cooler, the kettle, fridge, radio chargers, all coming from 1 plug. It is PAT tested, but the fact they've got so much loading on 1 socket, the wires are all just shoved down the side and it's actually next to a chemical cleaning cupboard, means that this is not looking good if they have a source of ignition at that point. So a simple way just to check if you are overloading your sockets is to go to the London Fire Brigade website, and they have this, it's like a game, but it's not like really exciting, but you can choose different appliances and plug them in virtually and it will tell you whether you're overloading your sockets or not. So that's something that's just quite useful to do. The other way to help prevent damage is fire loading. So people, I'm guilty of it. I know that lots of museums I visit, they've got some old cardboard boxes or some wood and they think that I'll just shove it in the store in the basement, or I just put it up in the attic, it might be useful one day. But we just have to think about those things that would help spread a fire, should you have one, and are they really needed to be stored, especially as usually the attics and the basements are used for collection storage also. And when I used to work with a fire safety advisor at English Heritage, he said the best thing you can do to prevent fires in your property is to get a skip and fill it with stuff that you don't need, that's just taking up space in your museum and adding to fire loading. Fire doors, I'm sure no one here has propped open a fire door with a fire extinguisher, but here's just a good example of how fire doors can work. So this is the Duchess Amelia Library in Weimar, Germany. They had a fire, and this is 2 sides of that fire door. So you can see that it absolutely stopped the fire spreading and protected the books on the other side. So that is just a quick run through of a bit of a reminder that incidents and emergencies do occur, a few examples, and which are the ones that we're most likely to see. So at this point, are there any questions or anything that people want to add or talk about their own experience? No, okay. Just checking the time, so it's 10:30. So we're just going to start thinking now about preparedness, and the big way we can prepare for an emergency is the emergency plan. So how many people, I'm getting the impression people are very happy with chat, but if people do want to shout out or put in chat who thinks they have a fully up-to-date, comprehensive, workable emergency plan? No, okay. It's it maybe people don't want to. Oh, go on.
No, I've got no plan.
Okay, thank you.
We
So
have one, but it's so out of date.
okay, so we haven't got one out of date. This is really common.
Yeah, ours will be way out of date.
So I've got a plan, but it's not very useful. So we did a piece of work during the pandemic where we not at all needs updating, but it's a good starting point. That's a positive way of saying it, absolutely. So we did a piece of work for Museum Development London during the pandemic. I feel like I'm moonlighting a bit. I feel like it wasn't the Southeast, it wasn't my museum development, but we carried out a survey of several museums in London, and it was really common that people had a plan, but it wasn't up to date, it wasn't disseminated, it wasn't particularly useful. So we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about the emergency plan. Or heavily rely on corporate knowledge. Yeah, that's a good point, that quite often it's in people's heads and not written down. So when I ask museum, and I've gone out to do an audit, do you have an emergency plan? The response I get is the emergency plan is nearly ready. So why sort of questions in my mind, why do people not get around to emergency planning? And I think some people don't find it very interesting. I think emergency plan is really interesting, but not everybody would agree. Just reading out some comments as well. We're updating ours at present due to staff changes. At the beginning of August, we had a flood. Everything worked as it should, and a number of documents now with Harwell. Fantastic. So that's great. Caroline, thank you for that. Emergency plan is never finished. It always needs updating. So emergency planning is boring. Some people think it's a waste of time. So quite often I get responses of it will never happen, which I think is incredibly brave and tempting fate to say that you'll never have an emergency or incident at your museum. Some people come up with if there's a fire or a big flood, we wouldn't be allowed in anyway, or you can't plan for everything, so what's the point in planning for anything? And also I get the responses, it's not my responsibility. And this is something I found really difficult when I was working at English Heritage, is that the curators would be asked to write an emergency plan. They would say, we're not in the properties, we don't know the buildings, so it would get passed to visitor services or the buildings people. They would say, no, it's a visitor services thing. So visitor services would then pass it on back to the curators. They would pass it on to conservators. And what would happen is the responsibility for emergency planning would just get passed from team to team to team and never really got addressed. So that's an issue. The final thing is it's hard to prioritize because you don't have a deadline for emergency planning. You don't know you're going to have a flood a week on Tuesday, so you better do something about it now. But you do know that the shop's going to open or a school group's coming in or whatever, lots of things. I know museums are incredibly busy. So I'm just going to talk about a few of these points. So it will never happen. I think we've shown that actually it does happen with the slides we've already seen. You wouldn't be allowed in is something that's not necessarily true. So this is London Fire Brigade safety note, and they've written one specifically on heritage buildings of special interest. Again, the link for all these things will be on in the document that you get sent. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it does say, have I pulled this out? It does say, wherever possible, at the top, the Fire and Rescue Service will attempt to facilitate salvage damage control as a high priority, providing crews of firefighters who will endeavour to remove artefacts, collections from areas unsafe for salvage teams to access. Similarly, the Fire and Rescue Service can work in support of the salvage team when they have been authorised by the incident commander to operate inside the premises. So essentially, all fire services are different, but London Fire Service is saying, we take the salvage of heritage incredibly seriously. We will give crews of firefighters to do this, and we will support salvage teams in doing this. However, they say the extent and value of the damage limitation team's training, so essentially the salvage team, will influence the confidence which the incident commander will have in it. This will directly affect the extent to which he will allow use to be made of the team. Teams which have been properly trained and are accustomed to working alongside firefighters and complying with their instructions will be much more effective than those which have not been trained. So, so in essence, if you have a salvage team who are trained and you have had exercises with the fire service, you are much more likely to be allowed to carry out salvage if you need to in your museum. And obviously it goes without saying, you should not put yourself in any danger or any of your staff or volunteers in danger to salvage, but the fire service, if they feel it is safe to do so and they know that you have training, will let you in. So the other issues that I want to talk about with it's hard to plan because you have no deadlines. So at the end of this training, what I'd like you to do is think about 3 things that you could do to work on your emergency plan or emergency planning and put a date in your diary. So we will do that. So if you want to think about the 3 things as we're going through the training, that would be great. You don't have to do that, but it's just something to help put in a deadline. And with it's not my responsibility, I would say that emergency planning in a museum is everybody's responsibility. I've responded to incidents where everybody has had to help. So I went to one property where the gardener said he hadn't been inside the house and worked there for 30 years, but he came in the house and he was helping us take paintings off the wall. So everybody needs to be part of the emergency planning. So what makes a good plan? If you Google emergency planning, you will come up with lots and lots and lots of templates, ideas, articles, And it, I think, makes emergency planning feel like this onerous, overwhelming, huge task to write a plan. In essence, an emergency plan is just the information somebody would need in your museum to deal with an emergency, presented in a way that is easy to find and use. So if I said to you, there's going to be a flood in your museum tomorrow, so-and-so who you work with will have to come in and deal with it, what information would they need? You might think, well, they'll need to know how to get in, where the keys are. Oh, I should tell them where the stopcock is, if they need to turn the water off. It might be useful to have the number of the plumber. In fact, it might be useful to have numbers of the staff so they can contact us. And in essence, that is all an emergency plan is. It's information that's useful if you have an emergency or an incident. It's better to have a good plan today than a perfect plan tomorrow. So I think people put it off because it feels onerous and it has to be this amazing, perfect plan. Just making sure that you have a list of phone numbers, just making sure you've got a piece of paper that says where the fuse box is, where the gas inlet is, where the stopcock is really useful. So if you can sort of break it down into bits or just do it bit by bit, it doesn't have to be this massive, overwhelming task. And I think that actually preparing the plan is part of the process. So Eisenhower said, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So some of the museums that we spoke to in London said that they had leaks during the pandemic. And the people who would usually respond, the curators, the conservators, the collections teams, either were shielding or couldn't get to the museum. And it was the security or the facilities teams that were dealing with the flood. And because they'd had emergency planning meetings in which they'd all discussed emergency plans and what they would do, these people said they felt confident in dealing with, in one of them cases, a fairly big flood, because they'd sat around and they'd thought about it. So I think the simple act of getting people in a room together thinking, right, what would we do if tomorrow we have a flood? What would we do? Is really useful. And again, from the survey, plans that were considered fit for purpose were plans where everybody or a variety of people from the museum had contributed. So I think at the beginning, somebody said, what's an emergency? It's something that would stop business. So we've been doing quite a lot of work with a major London museum trying to pull together their business continuity plan with their emergency plan. So things that hadn't been discussed were, would they shut the shop if they needed extra people to help? Would they close the exhibition gallery that people were paid for tickets if they needed somewhere to salvage to? So just sort of having these conversations was really, really helpful. So all of that, you're thinking, well, that's very good, but actually what should I put in my plan? I need more help than that. So what sort of things should go in an emergency plan? And the template I'm going to use, and I have to say that I'm heavily biased because I helped compile it, is the emergency response plan template that is given out by Historic England on their website. And again, you'll get the link to this. You don't have to use this plan. It's just a plan that makes sense to me. But I'll give you some examples of other templates that you could use. So obviously start with the information. So addresses, telephone numbers, the date of the plan, where other plans are, revision numbers and dates. And what we've started doing, what Spencer and Fry have started doing for plans that we help people write, is we've started using, I can't remember the name of it now, what 3 words to direct people to certain parts of the site if there's a sort of a good place to meet. And I can talk about that more at the end if anyone's interested. So typical sort of contents of emergency plan, evacuation procedures are really important. Contacts, so who can you call for help? Floor plans, which I'll talk about in more detail. Priority objects, so you might have identified objects that should be salvaged in preference to others because they're more significant or valuable or research, or they're really important to the main aim of your museum. Then we might have where you can take those objects to for salvage, what salvage equipment you have. There's information on what to do with damaged objects, what to do if they're wet or covered in soot. And then it finishes with guidance notes on roles and management structure. There's a risk assessment there that's already pre-done, so you don't have to do it during the incident. You've already pre-prepared a risk assessment for a lot of the common risks. There's a communication log, so you can record what decisions were made and when. An entry control log, so you know who's in the building. Guidance on working with emergency services. Bit of health and safety advice about what to do if you need to enter a flooded building. What to do if it's out of hours, and general emergency information. So it might be that you grab a template and you completely fill it in. It might be you think that's not relevant to us. Well, there might be something specific to your museum that you need to put extra information on. These are just guides, they're just templates. You can add and take things away as you see fit. Something else that we've been doing with some of the people we've been writing emergency plans with is we're trying to get information across really quickly. So we've used flowcharts and infographics, so people don't have to stop and read a whole load of text. The information's given to them sort of fairly quickly. So this is just what to do if you walk into this particular museum or its historic house and you see there's an emergency, and it just takes you through, does this require emergency services? Yes, dial 999. Even if you have alarms, you should always still dial 999. And it just takes you through the process when you've turned up on site, you're a bit shocked, you can't think straight, to tell you what to do. Contacts is really important. So how can you contact staff, your salvage team? Of course, you have to comply with GDPR to make sure people are happy to share numbers if it's their personal phone numbers, and that you control who has access to that information. It may be that you, if you have one, want to alert your press or communications team so they can put something out on the website or Twitter or whatever else. And you may need to contact visitor services or other people in your museum who are responsible for bookings. So if you have a school group coming in the next day or a wedding, that you start alerting people that that might not be possible. Really useful to have contacts for utilities. So if you need to call out gas, electricians, plumbers, tradespeople, specialists. So we're on quite a few emergency plans if people want conservators to come out and help them. Harwell, as was mentioned already, are really good that they can come out and help you salvage, and they provide a lot of equipment. And really usefully is other museums. So there's been a number of initiatives recently where local museums have got together and have decided to support each other should they have an emergency. So it's always worth thinking about your local museums. Do you want to at least swap numbers? Could you share salvage kit? Would they help you if you have an emergency, send people out to help you salvage? So that is something that is always worth thinking about. So plans. So if you have plans of your museum, it is quite possible that you might hand them over to the fire service, and what the fire service asks for, that they're a decent size, at least A2. They're laminated. If it's raining, if it's wet, if there's water around, they're going to get soggy. So having laminated copies is good. Some people I know don't agree with laminating things because of the environmental impact. So in those cases, they've got like map carriers, folders that they can put their plans in so they won't get wet. It's good to have 2 copies. If you do have to give a copy over to the fire service, it's good that you've got a copy for yourself. The plan should only have useful information on them. So at this point, if your property is on fire, you probably don't care where the smoke alarms are, or I don't know, all sorts of things that are on them that aren't useful. So it's worth trying to have plans that are just very clear about where different rooms are, where the stopcocks are, where the fire hydrants are, clearly labelled. It's useful to have one of the whole site that shows access. So if there's a gate that's difficult to get through, or I don't know, I can't think of anything today, all sorts of things that you might want the fire service to know, or it might be useful for people to know, that's good to put on there, along with fire hydrants. And ideally, you'd have a plan of the site and then a plan for each floor of your building. Priority objects. So can anyone shout out or put in chat if they've identified priority objects?
Cranbrook Museum has a disaster planning thing, and we have got about 4 pages of priorities to get out. Fabulous.
Okay, so I think it's really useful to identify, and we sort of do it in our own homes. You know, you wouldn't, oh great, quite a few people have grab sheets. So you wouldn't go in and grab, I don't know, your Sainsbury's shopping bag, but you probably would get your family photos. So it's just exactly as you've all done. It's the same process for your museum. So it's worth, as yes, we have a list of low, medium, high priority objects. Fantastic, with photos in situ. Brilliant. So I always think it's quite interesting when you walk around, and we used to do it with a conservator and a curator, used to walk around the English heritage properties and identify what was a priority object. So the curators would say what the priority object was, and then the conservator would talk about vulnerability. So actually maybe we'd get at the vellum bound books first, because we know that they won't do very well if it gets wet or hot or smoky. And I can remember going around a few properties where the curator would say, the priority objects in here are the paintings, the furniture, the textiles, the silver, the ceramics. So essentially everything. So it's very difficult to narrow down what is important, but really useful. The one thing I would just say is that priority objects are a priority, but they're not your only objects. So in an emergency, I have seen an emergency exercise, not a real emergency. I'm not sure it would happen in a real emergency, but an exercise. I've seen people discuss, these people were discussing for about 10 minutes whether that was the correct vase or not. And at that point, I was thinking, just take them both. You could have taken them both out now and come back in and grab something else. So priority objects are really important, but don't get blinkered by them. If you're going to take a crate in, open up a case and grab that one priority object, just put the other objects in while you're there at the same time. But really useful to have grab sheets. So here's just an example, probably similar to what you have. So you would have a plan of that floor. It's quite useful to show which floor it's on. So you can see here that it's on the ground floor, a plan of the room where the priority object is, and then a picture of the object, exactly as somebody said, in situ, with dimensions. So the fire service said that it might be that visibility is really low and they can't even see a picture in a frame. But if they know they're looking for something that's 4 foot by 2 foot, that will help them identify it. Likewise, they don't want to know it's Velasquez or the water cellar of Seville. They want to know it's a drawing, it's a painting of a man holding a jug. So it's about getting information on there that means people can identify this object as quickly as possible. And then other usual information there is if you need any specific equipment or how many people is needed to carry that object. Again, this is just an example. You are free to come up with whatever works for you. You can help identify priority objects if they are put away for winter. I know quite a lot of museums don't do this anymore. Or if things are in store, it's always going to be a balance between making things easy to identify in salvage and security. But some people do just identify their store objects with a star. So here's an example on the left where they've put a star on this wrapping of this object. And then in store, quite often people will put stars on boxes that have priority objects in them. So if you go in quickly, you can see that these are the boxes to grab. Some people use glow-in-the-dark stickers, but they're only really effective if you have light in your store, which you shouldn't really, unless people are working in there. So what works really well is these reflective stickers where you're going with a torch and it's really quick and obvious which boxes have to be grabbed in preference. Another thing to put in your emergency plan, you could start thinking about roles. So again, it's useful to think about how you might structure a team if you needed to respond to a major incident emergency. Again, it's with a caveat. Some people put names against roles, and I've seen that get very confusing where one person doesn't turn up, so somebody else has to take their role, and then somebody else takes their role, and it just causes confusion. So what I've seen work very well is that in the emergency plan, there will be just a quick summary of the role and what it involves. So when people turn up, they're assigned a role. Some museums or institutions have high-vis jackets with that role on it. So the rest of the team can see what role they are, and the fire service can also see who the incident coordinator is, for example. And roles are assigned that way. I have to also be honest that when I've responded to instances, there's been like 3 people. So we don't have a chance really to have teams and coordinators. But it's useful to remember there are different roles, and it's useful to remember that somebody should be thinking about communication, recording what's being decided. Somebody should be thinking about welfare. Is everybody taking a break when they should do? So, so some emergency plans will have a structure for salvage. This can be taken out of the plan and put up, and people's names entered in as they turn up. So you see what roles are free and who's doing what. And then there's just a bit of a reminder about what the role entails. So it could be that you don't have enough people to fill everything, but you might say, can you just think about security? I'll think about welfare, and can somebody else just document what we're doing and the times that things happened. So other things that might go in your plan are salvage and first aid instructions for collections. So what to do, how to dry out a book, what to do if your taxidermist got wet. It's useful to have pre-prepared logs, so communication logs, entry logs, so you don't need to start from scratch. They are there ready to fill in. Inventory sheets, so you can start to record what's been salvaged. Equipment lists, it's really useful to know what equipment's available. And I remember responding to a flood once, and I asked if they got squeegees, and they said they didn't have any. And so we had to use brooms to push out water for hours. And then at the end, they said, we don't really know what a squeegee is this one, after about 7 hours of brushing out water. So a squeegee essentially looks like a big, it's like a windscreen wiper, but huge. You can just push out lots of water really quickly. So that would have been really useful. So had they had a list of what they had, I could have seen that, and our response would have been a lot more effective. Risk assessments I've spoken about. Some people think about putting in a brief for social media or press or the website. So it's just sort of calmly together, putting a statement that can just be rolled out if you need to. Oh, bless you. So if you have a press department or a communications department, you're very lucky and they'll probably deal with that. But some people just think, here's something that we could just put out on the website or Twitter. Because if you have a large emergency or an incident, people will expect some kind of communication, and there's a sort of bit of a skill in it, and it's not my area of expertise, but the ones I've seen are quite clever because they give information about the museum, when it was founded, the collection they have, and then there'll be a statement at the end saying an incident has occurred, we're working with the emergency services. So you can give out a lot of information the press can use, they'll be grateful for, but you're not giving any specifics or details about what is happening with the fire or flood or building collapse or whatever you're dealing with. And then the last thing is that some people think about what to do after the incident. So what do you need to do if you need to shut the museum down? How do you make it safe? Do you need to get extra security? Do you need to bring in dehumidifiers? So there's just a bit of information on that. But again, it's your emergency plan. It's information that you consider is useful to pass on. And it's information that is useful at that time. So I've seen emergency plans which have logs of when the smoke detectors were checked. That information, great, it's recorded, not in your emergency plan though. That is not helpful if your building's on fire. Have another file for maintenance of those sort of things, but it's just information that you will want at hand when you are trying to make lots of decisions. As I said, there are other emergency plans. So this is the Harwell template, and I think no, it is, the link for that is on the document that you'll get sent. So it is it's the same, but I mean lots of things very similar, just in sort of slightly different order, and that is available on the link that you'll get sent. So are there any questions at this point? Or we're going to have quite a large question, I hope, question and answer session at the end. But if people have questions now about emergency plans or emergencies, now is the time, now is your opportunity.
Just a kind of random one that isn't that necessarily important. Should staff have copies of the emergency plan at home?
That is, that's a very interesting question. Well, it's very, yeah. So I think when you have copies of the emergency plan, there's a couple of things just to consider, or three things I guess to consider. The first is access. So if you only have one copy of the emergency plan, it's in your museum and your museum's on fire, then that's not very helpful. So then you do need other copies. So the second thing is where the copies are stored, they have to be secure. So I did go to one museum where they had in their shed that wasn't locked all their emergency equipment, including crowbars, and then a file and some spare keys actually, and detailing what are their most valuable objects. So you need to balance that information with keeping it secure. So if it is at someone's house and they have it securely in their house, then I think that's fine. But the third point is about version control. So some people have copies and copies of their emergency plan. It just means every time you need to update it, and it should be updated frequently or anytime there's a major change, it means you have to make sure you pull back all those emergency plans and issue new plans. Because if you've, say for example now, well, we're doing a lot of work on filming. So the property we're working at the moment, they've moved out all their star objects from one of the rooms and they've stored it somewhere else. So they've had to reissue a new, temporary emergency plan, giving the location and the current location of those objects. If there's an old emergency plan out there that somehow they have an incident and that turns up and it's got the wrong information in, that's really unhelpful. So, so I guess you need to make sure you've got access to plans. So if that's at someone's house, that's fine, but it needs to be secure, and it needs to be, you need to know which plans are where, so when they're updated, they all get updated. What a lot of people now are doing is setting up WhatsApp groups. So if there's emergency, they can just put a message out in the WhatsApp groups. Instead of phoning people, it's just one message that everyone gets. And what people are doing as well is that they are taking, they are putting copies of documents on that WhatsApp group. So you can scroll through your messages and find that there's an image of, I don't know, the call outs for people that can help, or, you know, information about where the stopcock is and how to access it and how to turn it off. So again, you have to be careful about security. But that is one way that it means that everyone has information quickly and everyone has their phone on them. So even if you're not at home, you can get some information fairly quickly. I think other people are looking at more advanced things on their phone where they can have a whole plan on their phone, but I'm not quite sure how that works. So Izzy's made a good point. This is something that could be stored securely on cloud-based storage, password protected. So yeah, so you can start to think about maybe having them digitally if people in your museum are happy with that. I know some museums where not everyone has a smartphone or is happy accessing that way. So it will have to be tailored to who's going to use your plan and what works for them. Does that answer the question? I feel like I've spoken a lot. I'm not sure if I actually answered the question.
I think we did.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any other questions at this point?
Hi Claire, that was really useful, thank you. I had a question, and you might go into this in the next section. You had a section in the plan about all the different types of objects, and you said about what you need, you put information in about what you need to do to each type of object. Will you go over that later, or is there a crib sheet of what people's first aid reactions should be, if you haven't got the services of someone like yourselves or Harwells? If you just
do a little bit, I can check. We'll have a break now for sort of 10-15 minutes, and I will double check that I've put that in, but I can do. It's also available on the Historic England website. They have sheets. They need updating actually, because I wrote them years ago, but I probably shouldn't say that, but they're still really good. So they have sheets by each material, and one side, or the first section, is how to handle and salvage them, and then there's a second section on what to do if they're wet or damaged. But I will make sure I put some very brief do's and don'ts in, because I think the most important thing is to take action. You can't just leave things wet and damaged. You need to do a bit of first aid, so I will put something in after the break to cover that.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? I have added in a few slides during that break. So now I don't know if all my slides are in completely strange order. So please bear with me. But I just wanted to put this slide in because I thought it was relevant to the discussion about where to keep your emergency plan, to just raise this really, that as I've said, all fire services are different, but the London Fire Brigade has something called the Central Risk Register, and this is where they have a central computerized database that usually warns fire crews about particular risks or hazards in buildings, but they can also carry records of art and historical objects. So this is a discussion about the Cuma Museum fire, because the fire service, it was just registered as council buildings, it wasn't registered as a museum, and the fire service said had they known it was a museum from the outset, they would have tackled that fire differently. So if you have a familiarization with your local fire service, it might be worth asking them if they do have any kind of central risk register, that you can make sure it is logged that your building is a museum and does have heritage, valuable art objects inside it. So computer's not playing. Just at this point, because we're talking about emergency plans, to just remind everybody, and I'm sure if you're going for accreditation and you are accredited, you are aware of this, that you do need to have a clear workable emergency plan to qualify for museum accreditation. And this is something that they really, it used to just be you need to have a plan, but now you need to prove that you have arrangements for staff and volunteers, visitors, collections and collection information. You have assessed the threats that may be a risk to your collection, show how you authorize, maintain, communicate and test your emergency plan, and how you share it with your staff and volunteers and the emergency services, how your museum works with emergency services, your priority salvage list, so it's great, you've also got grab lists, and when you review your emergency plan. So it's asking not only do you have a plan, but it's communicated to everybody, it's disseminated, and that people have carried out training on the emergency plan, and also it's regularly updated. For any of you that have undertaken benchmarks, you don't have to, but benchmarks is a free way just to assess how good your collection care is, and there is a whole section on I can't read the top because my top of my page cut off. I think it says emergency preparedness. So this is something that you can just have a look, and this will also give you a few sort of pointers if there's areas that you aren't scoring very well in. So I thought, because accreditation asks about testing the plan, oh, there's something in chat and I haven't got chat up. Oh, here we go. Kent Police will also hold info, so good idea to talk to them. Yes, and actually something that has just come to mind is that there's also plans in place about what to do if there's a major incident anywhere in the UK. So, for example, when I work for English Heritage, there's one of their houses in London that would be taken over if there's been a major bomb in London. It would be taken over as an admin centre. So at that point, it's not us responding to an emergency in our property, it's the fact that the government would take over that property to use. So we had to sort of just make a bit of planning for that. So it's always worth talking to the emergency services about what information they have about your building, and if it's been earmarked for any other use in a major incident. So moving on, so testing the plan. So there's different ways you can test the plan and when you should test the plan. So ideally, you would write your emergency plan, or you'd pull together information for your emergency plan, and you would train your staff and volunteers so they know what is in the plan, where the information is. Because ideally, when the first time you test the plan, you want to test the plan and not your team. So they need to know what information is available to them. So the first thing would be to tell them about the plan and what is in it. Then you could do something like a tabletop exercise. So either you have a scenario that you've worked out, you know, it's 6 p.m. on a Friday, it's raining, you're just walking past the museum and you see that there's water pouring into one room. What do we do? And then you might have another feed. You know, this room's got wet and you're worried now that this other room is going to have water ingress. You know, what do you prioritize? So you can kind of have a fairly structured discussion about the steps you'd take, or it can be really informal. So one of the documents I'll send you is something called Disaster Game, which again is used on the Historic England English Heritage National Trust course. And you roll a die and or dice, and you come up with a scenario. So you have 1 to 6 different scenarios, you have 1 to 6 different times and weather conditions, and you have 1 to 6 different, I can't remember, I should have looked at it before I did this training, I can't remember, a type of collection, I think. And then you have a wild card to add to the scenario. So you can just, again, it's a bit silly because, you know, it really piles on the emergencies on top of you, but it just really gets you thinking about, you know, you've got to deal with an incident, but there's a protest outside, or it's really bad weather and people can't get there, so there's only 2 of you. So you can just work through your plan. Is the information there that you need? Is there other information that'd be useful to have in there? Can you access the information easily? And usually things come up about, oh, well, we haven't got the key to that gate, so people can't come in that way. Perhaps we need someone else to have a key, or you know, perhaps we put a brake lock paddles, or all kind of things come up that you can then update your plan. And then at this point, it's really good to have a full-scale exercise. If you have the time to arrange one, it's really, really helpful. I will send out a checklist to help you organise an exercise. So some things to think about and how to help put that together, because it does take quite a lot of work to organise a fake emergency. And you may decide to have that with or without the fire service or the police. But I recently did one at a National Trust property, and the fire service were really, 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 really helpful. So it was great to have them there, and they had lots of feedback about the plan and what would help them. And similarly with the police, if you do want to invite them to help, it can be really informative. And then you update the plan again, and at that point, your plan is looking in pretty good shape until anything changes, and it needs to be updated. And then you need to think about when you will, either in 6 months or a year's time, do another full update. So it's going to be a sort of constant work in progress. It's never completely finished. I just want to put something in about working with the fire service, because we said about potentially having an exercise with them, and I have found them absolutely amazing to work with, really helpful. They will help salvage. They obviously put life first, but they may also, London Fire Service, life, fire, salvage. So they will tackle it in that order, but as I've said, they will help you salvage, and they see it's part of their responsibility to help you salvage. Apart from anything else, when I've responded to an incident, there's usually not a lot of people there unless it's a major fire. And here are people who are saying, we are willing to help you salvage. You just have to ask them to do things. So it's quite difficult when they've been in power and telling you what you can and can't do to suddenly tell them, can they pack up this or go get crates? But they will do that. They also come with loads of really useful kit and equipment and blow up tents and knives and tools. And this is an incident I went to. This was an incident, it's an exercise I went to a couple of years ago. And they have these screens where they can pull up information. And it's quite interesting that they had plans of this building in their central risk register. So they were saying that they could pull up all kinds of information for you. And that was their command center that you can liaise with them there. So really interesting to see that and how they work. It's also useful that they familiarise themselves with your building. So this is a property called Warmer Castle in Kent. I don't know if any of you know it. And it's round. And because the fire service, when they've got poor visibility, work from corners, they find it really difficult. So we used to have exercises there all the time to help them familiarise themselves with the building. So it's quite useful for them as well. They may want to put in a sandbag body or test hydrants or add something else to the incident. So it is really useful for training for them as well, but that is fairly easy to organise. But you do need to give them direction. So this is the Historic England Salvage course, or Historic England English Heritage National Trust Salvage course, I should say. And these firefighters were left and they were told that this table needed to be moved out. And the salvage team went off to get boxes and bubble wrap and all sorts of things. But by the time they come back, they just picked up the table and walked it out with everything on it, which was fine, nothing smashed, but they were there just with nothing to do. So you could have just sent them to get the boxes and crates, or it's just worth remembering how you use that resource. So reaction. So we're going to talk very briefly and rush through responding to something. And I wasn't going to talk so much about this, but we've got time, and I was going to put in a bit about how you deal with damaged objects. So I thought it might just be worth very briefly going through this. So this is actually Windsor Castle, where they were so grateful for people that salvaged the collections during the fire. They've put a stained glass window to them, which I thought was quite nice. Although he could be wearing gloves. But anyway, that's a very small pedantic conservator point. So just a quick thought about equipment. The types of equipment you should have in a salvage store to help you respond to an incident is personal protective equipment, absorbents. It's always useful having things that can mop up water. So New Pig is a company that lots of people use to have things that will absorbent pads and booms and all sorts of things. Packing materials, so bubble wrap and crates you can put things into. Tarpaulin, things that you may want to put, over objects, plastic sheeting, or to use to divert water. Documentation materials, so have you got paper, pens, inventories that you can record what's happening, what objects are coming out. Packing materials long term, so things that you might want to pack up and send off site, and they might be off site for years, so it has to be good archival quality packing material. Stabilization first aid treatment equipment, so trays, jugs, blotting paper, all sorts of things. And I have to say that dealing with damaged objects in emergency is a whole training course in itself, and something that we will talk on the longer emergency planning cohort we've started this year. So if anyone's particularly interested in that afterwards, let me know, but that is a whole another session, I'm afraid. Heritage Watch is also good, thank you, Andrea. And then you might need things like lighting, generators, trucks, things to move things. Again, you can get lists of what you should have in a salvage store, but it needs to be applicable to your collection. So you need to think about what you have, what equipment you might have to help you if it's covered in water or you need to move it, or what equipment you would help work in the museum. Oops. So you're going to have a store of equipment that's easy to get access to. You also need to think about equipment that you can get really quickly. So this is where we need to move some paintings quickly, not because it's emergency, but because there was filming in that property and they suddenly wanted to use a different room. We didn't have T-bars or plastic blocks, but we were able to very quickly get hold of pipe lagging. It's really cheap and it's available from all DIY stores. So this is something we could use quickly just to stack up paintings. So in emergency, that sort of thing would be really useful too. And if you don't have sorbents or you run out of sorbents, things like incontinence pads, incontinence sheets, pet incontinence pads, kitchen roll are things that, again, you can get hold of fairly quickly and easily. So your emergency plan, you might have where your nearest 24-hour supermarket is, or your nearest DIY store where you can go and get more and additional equipment. Or again, you might have contacts with local museums where they're able to lend you equipment. It's always worth making sure your equipment is ready to go. So if you have a wet vac, which is incredibly useful in emergency, it's worth making sure that it has been put together, because it is confusing to put a wet vac together. It is really confusing to put a wet vac together when you're trying to deal in the heat of an emergency. So equipment, and then we're going on about salvage. So again, it's about knowing your collection, knowing your priority objects, knowing which objects you think are particularly vulnerable, you may want to salvage first. You may have some hazards in your collections. So things like weapons, ammunition, things with asbestos in, mercury, radioactive, all sorts of things. It can be in collections that aren't great and you certainly don't want to be dealing with in emergency. So it's useful to identify those. It may be that it's not just collections in your museums. If you're in a historic building, it may be light fittings, door handles that you think you may need to rescue. And you'll need to think about objects that can't be removed, so you need to protect in situ. So this is actually during the war. It's Holland House Library, but you can see, even though that house was bombed, and it's complete chaos and destruction in the center of the room, around the edges of the room, the library and the books are still intact. The bookshelves and the books are still intact. So we know that if things do need to stay in situ, if you can get them to the walls, that's going to be safer. And I don't expect you to look at this in detail. This is just to remind me that if you have water ingress, you can think about ways of diverting water out of your property. And this came about because I taught on this salvage course at West Midlands Fire Service for years. And we always used to say, if water's coming in, put polythene sheets over your objects. And after about 10 years, they said, we don't understand why you don't tell people just to use the sheets to divert the water straight out the building, which actually makes a lot more sense. So you may want to just think about how you could do that. Or you can get leak diverters, again, from New Pig, where if you know you've got pipes or things that you're concerned about, or plumbing up above, you can put these up and it collects the water. It's like an upside down umbrella, collects the water and puts it into a bucket. Some people put them into wheelie bins, so then they can just wheel the water out. It's a bit easier than buckets. So this is a bit I've added in, so salvaging objects. Oh, this is where, okay, I've lost my pointer and can't, well, there we go, use the keyboard. So when you're salvaging objects, again, look for priority objects, but don't be blinkered. You can salvage everything if easy to at the same time. If multiple objects are at risk, give priority to undamaged objects. So I haven't written that very well. So if you have objects that are already damaged or wet, and you have some objects that are about to get damaged or wet, I would always go for the objects that are about to get damaged and rescue those first so they don't get damaged. Because ideally, the least things that you have to deal with that are wet and damaged, the better. So give priority to things that are about to be damaged but aren't damaged yet. When you're packing objects, try to pack wet and dry objects separately. Try to keep object parts together. So if something dismantles, to move it, try and record that they've all come from the same object. This is not, there's a lot of common sense. If you're packing a crate, put heavy objects at the bottom and make sure the crate's not too heavy or too full that you can't pick it up. And when you're packing for salvage, you are not doing beautiful museum wrapping, you are literally just stopping the objects knocking into each other. So something like this, where there's glass, where being salvaged, the bubble wrap is just put in between to stop them breaking when it's taken out to the triage area. So treatment. So you need to think about where you're going to take those objects, and it's useful if there's a space in your emergency plan that you've identified that. If you've got somewhere on site, that's fantastic. If not, is there a formal agreement with the town hall, with the school? When Clandon was on fire, they took a lot of their collection to the school hall, but that just needs to be formalised and agreed, and information about who to contact and where to get keys in your plan. It might be that you need to have gazebos or pop-up tents. And ideally, when you start to triage to that area, you'd have a space for wet damaged objects and a space for dry objects to keep them separate. So air drying, there's different ways you can deal with wet collection. You can air dry, and this is simply just spacing objects out, fanning out books. You might peg up pieces of paper if you think they're robust enough, just to let the air get to them and dry slowly. You may set up a wind tunnel. So that's effectively where you just create a tunnel. So for this example, it is polythene over a table, and there's a fan at one end, just direct air gently over the collections to help them dry out. Or you may just put objects out on something like blotting paper. So the blotting paper helps absorb any moisture. And again, you're spacing it all out to increase the air getting to different surfaces. So air drying is fairly cheap. The objects stay in your museum or where you're treating them, but it takes a lot of space. If you think about one object, by the time a pile of papers has all been put out on blotting paper, like you can see in the image, it takes loads of space. It is time consuming because you have to keep an eye on those collections. You have to change blotting paper until those collections are dry. So talking from experience, it gets really really dull really quickly, but you may be there for 24 hours if you need to. So it's relentless. An alternative is that you can freeze some parts of your collection. So freezing essentially just buys you time. It can prevent damage from inks running, or if something is so wet that it's going to swell and expand and cause damage, it can prevent that sort of damage. But it can be expensive. If you have freezing in-house, that's great. If not, you're going to have a contract with someone like Harwell to come and bring freezer trucks. It means objects leave site, so you need to make sure you document what has gone away, and you can't freeze all different types of material. So again, this is part of a lot bigger discussion about what to do with damaged objects, but that's sort of just a really quick overview. But with freezing, so as I said, if you've got lots of wet objects you can't dry out, if you've got dyes running, and if you've got a freezer you can freeze, then what happens is you can either take the objects out in batches and air dry, or you can freeze dry. And this is a process where essentially under a vacuum, the ice goes straight into a vapor and it never goes back into the damaging liquid phase. But you would need to pay for that service, and it can be quite expensive. Because we mentioned it before the break, I've just put in here something as an example, and this is from the Historic England website as an example for paintings. So there's sheets there for all different types of materials. It gives instructions on handling, things to be aware of, what order to remove those objects in, if they can be protected in situ, and then the first aid, what to do if it's wet and what to do if it's dry, and if it could be frozen or not. So they are available on the website. You can print them out, and that is something that could be quite useful in your emergency plan, and or a laminated copy with your salvage equipment. So they're to hand if you just want a prompt at the time about, oh, I've got a wet painting, what should I do? Just very, very briefly about health and safety. So health and safety is the highest priority. I don't think any museum expects its staff or volunteers to risk themselves to salvage the collections. So human safety first. So if you are told to evacuate the building, you evacuate the building. You don't try and grab something on the way out. And there's just a number of sort of headline health and safety things I just wanted to say. So you should not enter a building if you suspect there's any structural problems, like the ceiling's about to fall down, or there's lots of debris on the floor, there's lots of broken glass. You shouldn't enter if there is running or standing water and you don't know what hidden hazards there are in there, or if there's live electricity. And you shouldn't go in if you suspect the area is contaminated with sewage or mold. You should wait till there's sufficient lighting. If you don't know if there's hazard materials like poisons, mercury, ammunition, don't go in. You should not go in if you're alone and nobody knows where you are. At the very least, you should tell people, but ideally you wait for somebody else to be there with you. You need to be wearing the correct personal protective equipment. So just a reminder, that might be boots, shoes, gloves, a mask, a hard hat if there's risk of things falling or you're going to hit your head, high vis waistcoat, overalls and aprons, especially if the collection is in dirty water or it's very sooty. You want to A, protect your clothes, and B, at the end of the salvage, you can take that overall, the apron off and get rid of it. You don't want to take all the soot or contamination or sewage back to your house on your clothes. Eye protection might be necessary, and just a few other health and safety considerations. Be careful of slips and trips. So make sure you're wearing decent shoes. If there's trip hazards, I've seen people put a ladder in a doorway and then people spend hours walking over it, whereas they could have just moved the ladder. But to be fair, I didn't either. It's only when I saw the photographs afterwards I realised we'd done that. And again, make sure there's adequate lighting so you can see where you're going. Remember good manual handling. It's very difficult to get carried away and try and rescue everything, but you need to remember good handling techniques. And again, appropriate PPE, so you're happy to have the collection near you. You're not trying to hold it away because it's dirty or covered in goodness knows what. Be careful when you're working at height, using ladders and using tools. So during exercises, the most frequent injury is people trying to unframe pictures and either cutting themselves on the tools or the tacks or the glass. Just very, very, very briefly, because this is a huge topic, but welfare during an emergency. Humans are kind of wired to react in certain ways when our bodies are under stress and flooded with all different kinds of chemicals. And the way that people react is usually freeze, flight, or fight. And I've seen all of these where freeze, people just can't make decisions and they're so scared of doing the wrong thing, they don't do anything. Flight, at a big flood during a store, a curator just walked in and said no and walked back out again. We didn't see them for an hour or two because they just could not deal with seeing their store full of water. But the most common response is fight. So people are flooded with adrenaline and they sort of go into superhero mode and they're trying to rescue everything and pick up things that are heavy. And it's just really important, if you are salvaging, to make sure people are working safely and within their capabilities. People will need rest, water, food, warmth, shelter. So the acronym is HALT. So if you start to feel hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, it probably means you need to have some break, have some water, have some food. And just remember, people want to feel useful. So if people have turned up to help with the salvage, even if it's going to get bottles of water or standing on the door to make sure people who shouldn't come in don't come in, or stand on the gate to open the gate for the fire service, people will handle a stressful situation better if they're given something to do. And just appreciate that to you, a flood in the museum might be annoying. To other people, it might be really stressful. And it's just making sure that they have an opportunity. So quite often after an emergency, what we've done, even actually after emergency exercises, usually have a cup of tea and just have a chat about it and a bit of a joke about things that didn't go very well. So it means everybody managed to get it out of their system before they go home. So what we call a hot debrief. And just to finish up with, I wanted to show you an example of people who take emergency planning very seriously. So a few years ago, I was lucky enough to go to Schönbrunn Palace, just outside Vienna. And this is probably the best example of emergency planning or preparedness, just to give you something to aspire to, I guess. So this is a room that is, so this is their damage limitation team room, and this room's only purpose is to be used in emergency. So that's where they would have their debrief and talk about what to do. And there is all their labelled lockers with all their PPE ready to go. And this is the team, once a month they practice in the real rooms with the real collections, emptying and moving everything. So if anything happens, they are completely ready to go. So somebody once asked me, how much work is too much work on your emergency plan? So I would say, unless you're like Schönbrunn Palace, then probably you're not doing too much work on your emergency plan. So that, I think, oh yeah, I'll go into that section. So that is all I wanted to go through today. So now is the final opportunity for questions and to raise anything that you might want to add or talk about your own experiences. So please put questions in the chat or ask them out. It is also the time that I would like you ideally to write down, but you don't have to, 3 things that you thought of during this session that you thought, if I do that, that will help emergency planning in my museum. Then I would like you to pick a date. It might be a month, it might be 6 months, 6 weeks, depending on how busy you are. But I would like you to write down a date or put in your diary that that is the date you will have completed those 3 objectives. I used to write to people, but we can't do that now. I used to get people to write a letter and then I'd post it to them in 2 months' time, but that's harder by Zoom. So if you give yourself a deadline, and it might be just something simple like checking the phone numbers or making sure your plans are as they should be, or buying some new equipment for your salvage store. But if you just think of 3 small things that aren't too onerous or difficult and put in a date, that would be great. If anybody wants to put in the chat what they are to give examples to others, that would be brilliant also. So now I should just wait for the questions or comments. Oh, good. We've got 3 things. Thank you, Izzy. The anticipation's building now. What any else 3 things are?
Yeah, I pressed return before I'd finished writing. So.
Yes, it doesn't go to a new line, it just sends a message. That's caught me out a few times. People can
Actually,
say
instead of writing it, I might as well just say, so I'm going to review my plan, the emergency plan we have got. I need to add the new areas to it because we've just had a new archive store, research space and temporary exhibition space created. So they need to be added to it. And then check materials and equipment that we've got.
Fantastic, thank you.
Probably not going to do that. My deadline is the end of the year because we're currently moving back over 2,000 boxes into our archive store at the moment. So, but yeah, end of the year, hopefully.
So that's very nice. You've got a new archive store. That's fantastic. But now you've just got to do all the work to get into there.
Nightmare.
Yeah, it will all be worth it. Hi, David.
Claire, can I? Oh, sorry. Go on, David.
No, please, Mike.
I just wanted to say there are 4 things. Some are just observations, but one will lead into a question. The couple of things. First, I have absolutely no idea about whether we're PAT tested or not, so I'm going to be looking into that.
Brilliant.
Second is I haven't got a clue where the stopcock is, so I'll be looking at that. Thirdly, I thought a good idea in our case, we're all volunteers, is to have a fireproof cabinet somewhere at our single point of entry for our museum, which would have useful information in, possibly sets of keys, and the laminated plans for the fire brigade or whoever. Just a thought that a fireproof cabinet might be useful. And the one which I wanted to mention that you haven't mentioned so far is obviously there could be insurance implications here. We have insurance, so it would be notifying the insurance company, but also what help or assistance you might get from your insurance company, because there may be something within the small print. I don't know, but any comments you've got on that would be appreciated.
Yes, and you are absolutely right. I completely failed to talk about insurance, which is very important, because also I think some of them will want you to record what happened and when, and have good records of what was salvaged. So yes, you should absolutely, it's probably worth talking to your insurance company while you're doing the planning before you have, hopefully you won't have an emergency or an incident, but it's probably worth talking to them about how they could help. 24-hour numbers and actions that they wouldn't want you to take. So the only example I can think of is really stupid, but at a museum we wanted to take out the carpet because it's soaking wet, and the insurance company wanted to see the carpet before we ripped it out, even though it was a modern carpet and it just was holding loads of moisture in the room. So you are absolutely right. I completely failed to talk about insurance. I think it's because usually the institutions I work for, we had government indemnity, which was slightly different, but is sort of a form of insurance. But yes, and yeah, details of the insurance company in your plan, and how to contact them. They should have 24-hour numbers, and what assistance they can provide and what assistance they won't provide. So thank you, that's a very good point. Oh, David?
Claire, our museum is within a local authority site. It's a New Haven Fort. And I'm going to need to talk to them. In fact, I've been trying to get their risk assessment for ages and haven't managed it. So I do need to sit down with them to talk about their emergency planning, so that I can incorporate the parts from theirs into mine. So yeah, it's something that we're going to start on doing and make a start very, very shortly.
Great. Yeah. That sounds good. Yes, if you're part of a wider site and they have a business continuity plan or emergency plan, it's always useful to know what they've got planned and if your plan fits in with it. And I'm just thinking about one of our clients, they found that they were part of a bigger set of buildings, and that it didn't include their building, or that their building would be commandeered for something else. So they weren't particularly happy about that. So that's a really good point.
And to add to it, the local authority have hived the building off to a public services concession agreement. So makes it even worse, but we'll get there.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
We've got good communication with them, so that is going to be a benefit to getting the answers I'm going to need.
Oh, fantastic! And you could potentially use writing the emergency plan as a reason to chivvy them along to give you information for, I don't know, sometimes.
It certainly will. You having attended this court this day with you, I should be able to go along with them and point out a few things to them, I'm sure. So it's going to be very, very useful. Thank you.
Good, thank you. There's a few comments. So my mouse has stopped working, which is really not very helpful. So apologies if I missed anybody out. Checking, updating equipment, doing a tabletop exercise, brilliant, and regular briefing, share ideas, not really having to reinvent the wheel is a very good point. Update contact lists. Yep, it's always, I remember that my personal phone number was on a list, and somebody couldn't get into a store, so it wasn't even an emergency, and they phoned me. Not only was I on maternity leave, I was actually in labour at the time, so I was not particularly impressed. I think I probably said something rather not polite to them about phoning me at that point. So yeah, I probably should have made sure that my phone number was taken off all those contact lists for that a few months. New equipment kits, but need to get them out to the places that need them, and sort of timetable, staff info, training by beginning of October. Fantastic. I need to update our plan and create some grab sheets and put a second copy in the updated education centre. Brilliant. Training the rest of the team. As it stands, I would be the only person on site with any clue on what to do in this situation. Kimberly, that sounds a bit scary. So I think you should train them as soon as possible. Although it always surprises me that when we have had an incident, the people who you think will be really good at responding, actually sometimes if they're collections people, they do get, it's very emotional for them. And so we've had things like gardeners or rangers just come in and take over and do an amazing job of salvage. So some people are just really good in emergencies naturally. So hopefully, Kimberly, you've got some of those people in your museum, but you'll get them trained and then it will all be good. Okay, so we've got sort of a few minutes left. If everyone's done their 3 things, this is the final opportunity for any other questions. I will send the documents to Joanna, and my email, I think you probably all have it, but it's claire@spencerandfry.co.uk if you have any specific questions on emergency planning. And we also do one-to-one sessions as part of our agreement with the museum development. So if you do need any collection care advice or you want to talk to us and you contact your MDO, then I'm sure that we would be very happy to help. Sorry, Jo.
No, I was going to say the same, that, you know, as I said at the beginning, we do have this agreement with you about one-to-one support. And one more thing, did I just make it up, that you said that you, Spencer and Fry, can attend emergencies or provide equipment? And if so, did I imagine that, or?
No, we do. So it's kind of just informal at the moment. So we don't have any kind of service that we guarantee to answer the phone over 24 hours and be in the right part of the country. But a few of our big historic house clients have asked that we go on their contact list. So if they have a major incident, we can either give advice over the phone, or if it's really huge, we can respond. So yes, so it's not a guaranteed sort of service agreement, but yeah, our phone numbers are on quite a few that if they just need, and in fact there has been a couple of instances of Southeast museums where they've had water ingress and floods, and through the MDO they've contacted us and we've spoken through a few things over the phone. Well, that was because it's pandemic and it was in the middle of lockdown, where actually quite a few people seemed to have leaks during the middle of lockdown, which was difficult. But yeah, we'll do whatever we can to help, and we do have a whole load of equipment as well.
If people are putting those contact lists together, is that something, whether you said you don't offer a service as in a fee, a charged service at the moment, but an informal contact, it's always useful to have, even as you say, it's through the MDO as an after effect rather than as you say, you don't want your home number to be on the emergency plan contacts. So
yeah, but people, and yeah, so last weekend I got a text message saying water's pouring down a tapestry, what should I do? So we, yeah. Talk them through it also.
And one thing I will add, which as Claire has intimated about Harwell's, they do offer a priority user membership where up to 10 organisations you can have like a contract service with them. You do have to pay for some items, but it might be worth, if a group of you are close together and you think, oh, let's just have a look at that, then, as I say, Harwell's, it's a priority user membership. It does range from like £300 to £700 depending on what you want, but it's something to consider, especially if you're volunteer run, I think. So yeah, just to raise that, but there are people out there who can help. So thank you so much, Claire. Has anyone got any other questions? No? Super. As I say, these notes will be sent out to you. They'll also be put on our website, and the session that's recorded will be put on our website. And thank you so much for attending. I will see some of you at our emergency planning project, which starts next week. And thank you so much to all of you, and to Claire, thank you very much too.